I've been working on a prototype that takes place in mini 3D planets that have working for gravity. Out of all the mini projects I've been working on recently, this one was by far the most entertaining, both to work on and to play around with as I was developing it. In this video, I'll talk about my progress, design choices, and challenges I went through. I intend to use this video as a way to gauge people's interest in such a game before I continue developing on it, so if you make it to the end, please let me know your thoughts. I initially set up the camera so that it would always be pointing down at the player as the player roamed around the planet. Afterwards, the second step was to set up the bullets that will orbit around the planet as if there's a gravitational pull from it. I initially achieved bullets orbiting, but perhaps not in the way I really wanted them to. In order to achieve a more stylistic look, I decided to use a low resolution aspect ratio that can still handle the bloom effect, and I gotta say, it made the game look a lot more stylish with just some geometric shapes. The next step was to set up auto shooting, as it is the staple of games like Vampire Survivors and Brotato. The thing is, when the enemies are around the 3D mini planet and your bullets are supposed to orbit around to shoot them, acquiring targets gets a bit more challenging. At the end, instead of scanning enemies with a complicated set of rays that are supposed to curve around the planet, I decided to just check the complete enemy list and compare their distances. This may sound more costly, but considering the number of enemies, it was really not that big of a problem. So at the end, getting where the target was easy, but instructing the weapon to automatically shoot at the enemy wasn't as straightforward. The solution I came up with was to have a 2D plane around the player, always aligned with the player's orientation to the planet. After the closest enemy is calculated, the enemy's position would be casted onto the 2D plane, and the directional vector from the player to that casted position would be the direction that the player would shoot towards. Next, I decided to add some blockers around the map, because without them there really isn't no difference between a curved planet or a flat field if you think about it. After adding some cool color patterns for the planets, as well as color matching rocks, the visuals really started to come together. I labeled this footage the first checkpoint because I had a working portal that charges up with defeated enemies, and once it's fully charged, the player can move on to the next level, technically can play forever. Next, I put an astronaut model for the player and a cool alien model for the enemies. Now for the weapons. Until now, the bullets were just spawning off of the player, but it was time to add individual weapons so that the player can use multiple at the same time. It took some trial and error, but I was able to get the aiming work for all weapons. Same logic as described earlier, but this time each weapon would individually determine their best target to shoot. But don't worry, there's also a manual aiming setup as well. I won't get into the details, but it works in a similar way, where the pointer click is casted onto a 2D plane perpendicular to the player to determine the direction of the shooting. Since this is a prototype, just to have a variety of weapons, I added explosive weapons, melee weapons, which again took a bit of thinking to make it work around the 3D planet. At the end, I decided to go with actually swinging the weapon horizontally to the player and not curving with the planet. Instead, I just gave them really large hitboxes, large enough such that if the enemies are technically below the weapon, they would still get hit. I also added a cool lightsaber swinging animation if they aren't attacking anyone. For melee weapons, I wanted to have multiple kinds of attacking kinds. And stab was easy enough, determine the target direction and extend the weapon, but slash, or I should call it a swing, turned out to be a bit more challenging. It was particularly hard to make all the animations feel smooth and right around a 3D planet where the player can keep moving while the animation is being cast. Especially because I'm a psychopath and I don't use any kind of animator or Unity animations. I just code my animations using math, which becomes a nightmare when you need to consider all those things I just talked about. But yeah, if it works, it works. Can't have a roguelike-esque game without some sort of upgrade system, so I whipped up a quick shop. Due to the low-res style of the game, I wanted to keep the text to a minimum and mostly just use shapes. By the way, this cool 3D models in the 2D UI is done by using camera stacking in URP. Basically, you can have multiple cameras that conditionally display different things, and you can overlay these visuals on top of each other. About 10% of the time though, something in URP breaks and these models become ginormous because they're being rendered by the main camera where they shouldn't be, but it actually kind of looks cool and ominous, so I don't even hate it. For rarities, I decided to just use different colored lights, which adds more to the retro feel anyways. With the addition of the shop, technically there's a complete game loop. Even though it's a very much bare bones, night shift about to quit their job game loop, it is there. You can play the game. Going beyond this point would be me adding more content to the game and fleshing it out. I think the low-res visual style looks cool, but it also makes adding everything else harder since it is really easy to differentiate things. Therefore, it really pushes me to the boundaries of using different shapes and colors to tell different things apart, But you know, maybe that's an interesting challenge to overtake, considering that I suck at 3D modeling. But now imagine if I flesh this game out with more enemies, more mechanics, boss fights, different planets with unique effects, etc. And while doing all of that, I will keep the input system to a very minimal 4-directional movement, so you could play this game easily like Brotato, or even on mobile with just a swipe of your finger. What do you think? Would you be interested in a game like this? Please let me know in the comments down below. Thanks for watching, hope to see you next time.